I'm Beth Saltz from Nutrition in the Kitchen, and I'm going to show you how to make a brisket from start to finish. So let's get started. So the first thing that we are going to do is we're going to talk about all of the ingredients and then what you will need, kind of the hardware to cook it all, the pots and pans and things like that. So the first thing is the brisket. So this is a really tiny brisket. It's only about 2 pounds. Typically, if I'm cooking for a crowd, I'll be getting a 6-pound brisket or a 7-pound brisket, the biggest one that I can find, or I'll get several smaller briskets. So this year, April 2020, it's a lot different. So we're not gonna be having 30 people at our house, but you still might be making a little extra. Like I know I'm going to be bringing brisket to some relatives and dropping it off. But you buy whatever size brisket is appropriate for your family. So I want to flip the brisket over so you can see the other side. You definitely want to get a brisket that has the fat cap on. So this is the fat on the other side of the brisket. So brisket is a really tough cut of meat and you're going to be cooking it low and slow. You need this fat cap to protect the meat from drying out. So don't worry about it. Later we're going to be removing the fat, but for now it's a really good thing that the fat cap is on. All right, so you have your brisket, and how are you going to cook it? So some people just kind of throw everything in a crock pot with some onion soup mix or something like that. But my brisket, I like to develop a lot of flavor every step of the way. Every time I can, I'm going to add flavor. So the first thing that you're going to be doing is browning your brisket in some kind of heavy-duty pan. And if you're gonna buy a really big brisket, you have to think, well, do I have a pan that is gonna fit my brisket? So I do have a gigantic pan that I can use, but for today, I'm just gonna use kind of a standard pan. Then when it's time to put everything into the oven, you have a couple choices. So if you have something like an enameled cast iron pot, you can use that. This is great. It retains heat very well and you can cover it. So that would be a really good choice. If you don't have one of these or it's too small, the one that you do have, you can just use your garden variety kind of Pyrex casserole dish. These are under $20. You can get them in many different sizes. And if you are doing this, you'll want some foil, heavy duty foil and big foil if you can. But right now with the ingredients, we kind of have to be flexible. So just have some foil and a Pyrex dish. You're going to kind of be creating a packet to seal it to make sure all that moisture stays in. So now we're going to move to the rest of the ingredients. So kosher salt is really important. So when you're cooking brisket, now is not the time for fancy Himalayan sea salt and expensive salts. This is really inexpensive. You can get it at most markets and it would be a great addition to your brisket. I use it almost every day actually in almost anything that I cook. So this is good. If you can't find it or don't have it, then you can substitute regular salt too. Regular ground black pepper. You can use a pepper mill or whatever pepper that you have. No fancy pepper. Some kind of oil that is good with high heat. So in this particular recipe, you don't want to be using extra virgin olive oil. Canola oil is a really good choice. You can use regular vegetable oil or maybe peanut oil or grapeseed oil. Tomato paste. So tomato paste, this is another way we're going to build our flavor. I love the tomato paste in a tube because you can just keep it in your refrigerator. It's really easy to work with. Canned paste is totally fine as well. You're gonna need a couple just regular yellow onions sold at most grocery stores. You're gonna need some garlic. If you find pre-peeled garlic, it's a great time-saving trick, or just regular garlic. You're gonna need a little bit of brown sugar. And then herbs and spices. So you're gonna need paprika. And I use a little cayenne pepper, but you can leave it out. It's up to you. Bay leaves, you can probably find these pretty easily right now if you don't have them in your kitchen. This ingredient might be a little tougher. I had to go to a couple stores to find fresh thyme. So if you do find fresh thyme, it lasts a long time. And as you start your shopping, if you find it, pick it up because you might not find it a couple days later. You're gonna need some kind of red wine. And I'm gonna have some brand suggestions and kind of something you can print out. You can look on my Nutrition in the Kitchen Facebook page or my Nutrition in the Kitchen YouTube channel for kind of further brand recommendations. Some kind of chicken broth, and then lastly, to finish off your sauce at the very end, some apple cider vinegar. So when you have all of these ingredients, then come back to the video and we will get started. Now we have all of our ingredients and it is time to cook our brisket today. So we are going to talk about salting and prepping the brisket. If you buy a kosher brisket, you do not salt it again. So for those of you with a kosher brisket, you're going to kind of just skip right to the prepping the other ingredients. If you do not have a kosher brisket, if you couldn't find one or for whatever reason, you are going to salt your brisket ahead of time. So this is kosher salt and some black pepper, and I'm just gonna mix it together. I find it a lot easier to do it this way than to be doing it separately. So, and then when you're done with this, your hands were probably touching raw meat and you can just discard the salt and you don't have to worry about food safety. So you start with the fat side up and you're just gonna poke some holes just like that and pat it dry. We don't want extra moisture. Now we're going to salt and pepper the brisket, and this is gonna stay for about an hour while you prep everything else. So you grab much more salt than you would think, a good kind of 3 fingers full, and from maybe a foot up, you're just gonna very evenly salt your brisket. It almost is gonna look like snow on the ground. So I would say probably this was about a little over a teaspoon on this side. And now I'm going to flip it and get rid of the extra moisture on this side. Here we go, and then repeat. So it is nice and evenly salted. Okay, now we're done with this part and it's just gonna sit for an hour. In the other video I mentioned, I'm actually gonna do this the night before and just let the salt penetrate through the meat the whole night. That's up to you, or you can just do it for an hour. And you wanna keep this out at room temperature now. And this would also be a really good time for you to preheat your oven to 300 degrees. So preheat your oven, brisket salted, and now we're gonna prep our ingredients. So the onions, this is 3 onions. If you're making a big brisket, you can very easily double all of this, so you would just slice up 5 or 6 onions. It does not have to be perfect. No one's checking your measurement. It's just very basic onion slices, just like this, not mincing. We want slices. And chop up your garlic, doesn't have to be perfect. I measured out 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and 1 tablespoon of the tomato paste. Here I have the paprika, and then I put the cayenne right on top of the paprika because we're gonna use them at the same time. Here's a ½ teaspoon of kosher salt that we're gonna use later. I have my 1 cup of chicken broth. I have my 1 cup of red wine. And then I have my thyme and my bay leaves. And you don't have to measure this, just throw a good handful of thyme in. So you want all of this ready to go because when the actual cooking starts, you want to just really quickly and easily have all of your ingredients on hand, everything's pre-measured, and it'll be a lot easier and much more simple for you to do. It is time to get started and brown our brisket. So the first thing that you want to do is turn your heat on. Depending on how your stove works, somewhere between medium high. And then you're just gonna let it heat up for about a minute. If you put your hand above the pan, you'll feel the heat rising up. And it's really important to let this pan totally heat up before you add the oil. Now, if you're cooking a really large brisket, and you don't quite have a pan that will fit it, it's okay if the brisket goes up the sides a little bit. You'll just have to kind of maneuver it just a bit to make sure it all gets browned evenly. Okay, so I'm going to get ready to add my oil. I didn't put an exact measurement because if you're using a bigger pan, you're going to need a little bit more oil, but you definitely want to add enough oil that the whole bottom of the pan is coated. We're not deep frying, so you don't need a whole lot. This is probably a tablespoon or so. And now we want to wait another minute or so until the oil is shimmering. And if it's hard for you to tell, if you give it about a minute, that's more than enough. So we're getting there. I can actually already see the oil shimmering a little bit. We are going to be putting the brisket fat side down. So that's the first step. It's going to be fat side down. It might splatter a little bit. That's why I'm wearing long sleeves. Just kind of be careful when you're ready to put it in. If you want to check the temperature of the oil, what you can do is just put a little water in the pan. All right, so my oil is definitely ready to go. Now you're going to hear a big sizzle. Now this is going to take probably 6 to 7 minutes. Don't touch it, don't move it, just wait 6 to 7 minutes and then we'll check it and then it'll be time to flip it over. I'm going to peek at the color of the brisket and see if it is dark enough. And I'll show you real quick what I'm looking for. I might have to flip it back over. Be very careful so it doesn't splatter. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I'm just gonna briefly turn it back over. Okay, so the fat side is still down, and as soon as it has this great golden color, you're gonna flip it fat side up. Be really careful. It's hard to maneuver with the tongs. Okay. So what we did by achieving this color is we're developing flavor. And also the sort of brown bits that you're seeing on the pan, that is going to also develop your flavor. Now sometimes if you have a very large, heavy brisket, you might need to use 2 tongs. You might even need someone to hold the pan handle to keep it steady. You just really want to be careful that when you're flipping it and moving it in and out of your pan, that it's a stable surface and nothing's going to fly up and hurt you. Another thing to keep an eye on, I have plenty of oil still in my pan. You don't want it to be dry. So if it looks too dry, then feel free to add just a little bit more oil, but this is good right now. And I'm just gonna let it go for probably another 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll check the color again. All right, it's been about 6 to 7 minutes, and I'm going to check the color. Okay, we are doing good, we're doing good. So temporarily, I'm gonna move my heat to low, and I'm gonna transfer this brisket out of my pan and put it in some kind of container. I'm going to use this roasting pan, but you can also use a plate or a platter. Be really careful so you don't get splattered. Okay, keep it fat side up. All right, so now it's resting fat side up, and we're going to get ready to cook the rest of our ingredients. The brisket is out of the pan, resting separately, and now we are going to put in our onions, our brown sugar, and a ½ teaspoon of salt. So notice that I do still have plenty of fat in my pan. If your pan kind of looks dry, it's fine to add a little bit more oil, like maybe a teaspoon or 2, but this is a really good amount to cook the onions. I also lowered my heat just a little bit. I'm around like medium low. My stove runs really, really hot, and I really want to cook these onions gently. So add all of your onions, and here's my ½ teaspoon of salt and my brown sugar. So some of my onions are a little bit clumped together, and it's okay because as they cook, they're going to naturally and gently come apart. Right now the onions are very white, but at the end of this 10 to 12 minutes, they're going to become very golden and very soft, and that's what you want. This is another step where we are really building flavor as we go. You don't want to burn your onions. We're basically doing an initial kind of caramelization. And in a second, I'm just gonna be hands off. Every, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, I'm gonna give them a really good stir, and I'm just gonna let them gently soften and cook down and get nice and golden. The onions have cooked down a lot, and they really have this nice golden color, and any kind of big chunks of onion have nicely separated. So now we are ready to move to the next step. The next step is adding our garlic. We're going to stir that up, and then we'll add the tomato paste, stir that really well, and then we'll add the paprika with the cayenne if you're using cayenne. So we don't want any of these ingredients to burn, so you might want to turn your heat down just a little bit. Mine is just below medium. You definitely don't want it right now on high or medium high. So this is going to go pretty quickly. So the garlic goes first. Whenever you're heating garlic in a pan, you want to keep the color on it just to golden. You don't want it super dark brown, definitely not black, because then you've burned it. So this pan has plenty of fat in it and a lot of moisture from the onions, so it's not going to burn. You just kind of want to stir it the whole time. You'll start to smell the garlic. And in about another 20 seconds or so, I'm going to add the tomato paste. All right, so let me get my tomato paste ready to go. And you'll stir this. I can really smell the garlic now. Gorgeous colors. Okay, this is looking good. I'm going to get ready to add my paprika. And I have just a little bit of cayenne, just a shake, maybe 1/8 of a teaspoon. After all of this is incorporated, we're going to get ready to do the next step. In just a second. Just want to make sure there's no big clumps of tomato paste. Make sure everything is nice and evenly combined. We have reached the last 3 ingredients, and then our brisket is about ready to go into the oven. So my heat is on medium. I'm going to add my cup of red wine, a cup of my chicken broth, and then I'm going to add in the bay leaves and the thyme. So this is just going to combine. I'm going to cook it for about 5 minutes, let it thicken just the tiniest bit. Make sure it's nice and hot. And then we are going to prepare our pan to go into the oven. So just let this hang out and cook for about 5 minutes. We are ready to put our brisket into the oven. My oven is preheated to 300 degrees. If you're going to use a taller pot like this, make sure that you move your oven rack low enough so it's all going to fit. So if I were using my Le Creuset, I would just put the sauce right into the pot and put the brisket right on top, cover it and put it right in. Today, so you can see, I'm going to use this so you can watch how I do the foil. So this is the only foil I have right now. Normally I have the really long heavy duty foil, but I'm just going to have to make do. So really long sheet. and you're gonna wanna do it vertically and horizontally. I'm gonna need to do another sheet because it's not quite long enough. Okay, so this is ready. I might even do one more sheet lengthwise. There we go, okay. All right, so now you want to carefully get your pan of sauce and just transfer it right into here. Make sure everything comes out. Okay, and now you want to grab your brisket and you're going to put it fat side up. It already is fat side up from when you browned it, so you're just going to drop it right on top of the sauce. Anything that happens to be left, you can just pour it out. Extra little bit of flavor. Okay, and now I am going to bring the foil together. Not super, super tight because you are going to be checking it later to see if it's done, but you definitely don't want a lot of evaporation happening either. Okay, so have my little packet, everything is good. So a bigger brisket is going to take 4 hours to cook, maybe even a little bit longer. This one is pretty small, so I'm actually going to check it after 3 hours. And you'll want a fork to go in and out super, super easily. You'll see on the video, I'll show you how I check it. One time I actually bought a kosher brisket, and even after 4 and 5 hours, it still was not tender. So I was talking to a couple friends and we figured out that it was probably frozen first and it had not completely defrosted. So that's why, for some reason, I think that one took over 7 hours to cook at a really low heat. All right, so I'm ready. I'm gonna open my oven and just put it right in. Okay. All right, I'll set my timer for about 3 hours and we'll come back and check it. My brisket cooked about 4 hours, and then I tested it with a fork, and the fork went in and came out really, really easily. So I knew that it was okay to take it out of the oven. So when you take it out of the oven, it needs to sit for about an hour. Just needs to cool down a little bit. And then we are going to do the next part right now. So temporarily, I'm just gonna take the brisket out and just put it in a different container temporarily. Now it is time to strain the sauce. So I have a bowl with a strainer set up. This can be a little bit messy. If you have a second pair of hands, it can definitely help, just because it gets messy with the foil and all that. Just in case your pan is still hot, use a pair of hot pads, and you're just gonna strain everything. Okay, there's some onion stragglers in here. I'm just gonna put the rest through the strainer. So I'm going to refrigerate this, and I'm going to cut it cold. It is much easier to cut brisket cold, but you can make it and serve it the same day. That's fine. However, I kind of like doing it the day before and then just putting it in the refrigerator, because then I can clean up my kitchen, I can clean up all these bowls, and it's just one kind of less thing to have to do the day that you're having your Seder. But it's totally up to you. Okay. All right, so we have our sauce and we have our onions. The sauce is gonna be separate. And then I'm just gonna try to remove the bay leaf, and if I can find the sprigs of thyme, I'll take those out as well. It's not vital, but if you happen to see them, just grab them. Okay, I see one more. All right, that's done. Okay, so the onions are going to refrigerate separately. Okay, that's all going in here. And I think that my sauce will all fit in this new container. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to cover both of these with plastic wrap with a couple little vents. I'm going to refrigerate them, and when they're cold, we'll come back and do the next step. I just took the brisket out of the refrigerator. So here's the brisket with the sauce, and here are the onions. For now, I'm just going to set the onions aside. You want to grab the brisket out of the sauce. Right now it's fat side up, and I'm gonna flip it so it's fat side down. The sauce, I'm going to pour into a saucepan, and we're gonna reheat the sauce, and then we'll taste it for seasonings and add the vinegar. Set that aside. Okay, so the sauce is going to gently reheat, and need my glasses for the slicing part. This is probably the most important step of brisket because you want to cut it properly. We're going to find the grain, which are these lines that go across the brisket. We're going to find the grain, and we're going to cut the opposite side of the grain. So hopefully we can zoom in tight enough, and I'll show you that the grain is going this way, like this. So if you were to cut along these lines, if you were to cut along the grain, your brisket will be stringy, not very good. So whatever direction the grain is going in, we want to cut the opposite, which is called slicing across the grain. So I'm going to start slicing. I'm not cutting the fat off yet. I'm just gonna slice all of this real quick, and then I'll show you how I get rid of all of this extra fat. It really, really helps that the brisket was refrigerated. If you try to cut it and it's really, really hot, it kind of falls apart, and it's really hard to keep the slices intact. Another thing that you might find, if you make a really large brisket, you might have to cut it in half and then cut across the grain. Otherwise, it just kind of, you'll see that it becomes a little more difficult to cut if the slices are really long. All right, so this is where having a dog will come in very handy. They are going to love all these little extra bits. All right, so this one is fine. There's not a kind of big glob of fat on it, so I'm just gonna pop it right back into that same container. There's a little fat on here I'm gonna take off. I kind of have my little garbage bowl here. So there's this still, it's a very small amount of fat. When we get closer to the center, you'll see that there's a lot more fat that you'll start to see. Okay, so I'm just trimming. Since this was such a small brisket, the slicing is going to go really, really quick. Also, if you happen to see that there's a lot of kind of congealed fat on the top of the sauce, it's great to skim that off as well. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, but now the layer of fat is much thicker, and I'm just going to gently slice that off. And all of this is going to make my dogs very excited. Okay, this is probably the biggest amount of fat that I've seen. almost done. Okay. So the brisket is sliced. It will normally, just so you know, it would take a much longer time if it was kind of a 6 or 7 pound brisket. This is here. Okay. So now I'm just going to kind of give the sauce a little stir. I'm going to start tasting it and then adjusting the seasoning. I'm actually going to grab my garbage bowl again real quick. I have these little mini tasting spoons. So I'm just going to start by an initial taste before I add any more salt, anything like that. And it's very sweet right now, too sweet. So I already know that I need to add some salt. This is my standard kosher salt. I'm probably gonna add like around a quarter, third of a teaspoon, a little black pepper, and I am gonna add a little splash of apple cider vinegar, a teaspoon, about a teaspoon, because I had a small brisket. I would add double the apple cider vinegar with a bigger brisket and more sauce. The vinegar is really important because the acidity is going to cut through the richness and the sweetness and give it a really good balance. Okay, that's a lot less sweet. I think it needs just a little bit more salt, a little bit more pepper. I'm going to add one more splash of vinegar, add my onions, and then I'll show you what the next step is. Okay. That is good. I'm gonna add all the onions back in. Almost done. So I'm gonna pour all of this right over the brisket. Found a bay leaf that I didn't see yesterday. Get rid of that. Okay, so you are just going to cover this with foil and then reheat it anywhere really between like 300 and 350 degrees. Whatever else you have in your oven reheating, you can combine it all, it's fine. Because there's a lot of sauce in here, I'll often put it on a cookie sheet just to prevent any kind of spills and juice explosions. So cover it with foil, reheat it, and you have your Passover brisket ready to go. Thank you so much.